You know, it is kind of wild to think about, but the United Kingdom, which is literally one of the oldest democracies on Earth, they didn't officially have a Supreme Court until 2009.
Right, yeah.
And then on the flip side, you look at China, and their national legislature has nearly 3,000 members. Usually when we talk about how a country is run, we just love simple labels.
Oh, absolutely. We definitely do.
Like, we look at a map, sort things into neat little boxes, and say, well, that one's a democracy, and that one over there is a dictatorship. It's binary, you know? It's clean.
It's comforting, too. I mean, we naturally want our political worldviews to be easily categorized.
Mm-hmm.
But when you step into the mechanical reality of comparative government, those neat little boxes fall apart very quickly.
They really do.
You start to realize that global political landscapes are incredibly complex. And every structural choice, it is entirely deliberate.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive for you. We are taking a massive stack of AP comparative government resources. So study guides, course frameworks, reference sheets, and we're using them to pull back the curtain on how 6 specific countries actually operate.
Right, which is a great lineup.
Yeah, we've got the United Kingdom, Russia, China, Iran, Nigeria, and Mexico.
And we should clarify right up front for you listening, we are looking at these political systems exactly as the academic source material presents them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
We are not here to endorse any specific ideology, regime, or political viewpoint. The goal is just to impartially explore the political science frameworks used to understand global government. We're looking at the mechanics, not taking sides.
Right. We are just the mechanics opening the hood. But before we look at the specific gears, you know, the branches of government, we have to separate the actual physical country from the people who are currently running it.
That is a crucial distinction.
Because the sources use 3 very distinct terms that people tend to mix up all the time: the state, the regime, and the government.
Right. In political science, precision really matters. So the state is the permanent physical reality. It's the territory, the population, and the sovereign institutions that hold a monopoly on the legitimate use of force.
Okay, so if the state is the physical borders and the permanent institutions, then the government is just the current administration sitting in the chairs, right?
Exactly. The government is simply the set of individuals legally empowered to make decisions right now. And the regime, well, that's the operating system running in the background.
Gotcha.
It's the fundamental rules of power that endure over time, basically dictating how those chairs are won or lost in the first place.
You know, it actually helps me to visualize this as a car, which is an analogy from the sources. So the state, the country itself is the physical car.
I love this analogy. Yeah.
And the regime is the rules of the road. It's the traffic laws, the speed limits, just the fundamental way society agrees to drive. Then the government, the executives, they are just the drivers currently behind the wheel.
Right, exactly.
And the bureaucracy, like the civil servants, they basically act as the GPS navigating the route.
That analogy works perfectly because it highlights the difficulty of change. Swapping out the driver is relatively easy. You know, that's just an election.
Right.
But changing the fundamental rules of the road, the regime itself, is an incredibly difficult long-term endeavor. We call that democratization.
And it doesn't happen overnight.
No, not at all. As political scientist Samuel Huntington outlined with his waves of democratization, it is a slow process, not a light switch. It requires developing specific characteristics over time, like government transparency, civil rights, and the rule of law.
Wait, let me push back on that framework for a second. If democratization is about the rules of the road and free and fair elections are the hallmark of those rules, well, what about a country like Russia?
Okay.
Because Russia holds regular elections. Vladimir Putin wins them. So why doesn't that classify as a democratic consolidation?
Well, because elections alone do not make a democracy. This is exactly why those simple labels fail us. Russia is categorized by political scientists as an illiberal democracy or a hybrid regime.
A hybrid regime, okay.
Right, they hold elections, yes. But the ruling United Russia Party maintains near total control over the apparatus of the state. The media is heavily influenced by the government, political opposition is stifled or sidelined, and candidates are strictly vetted before they even reach a ballot.
Ah, so it's like having a steering wheel in the car, but the steering column is disconnected from the tires?
That is a great way to put it, yeah.
Like the citizen feels like they are driving the car through a vote, but they can only actually go in the direction the manufacturer already decided.
Precisely. True democratic consolidation means the system has matured to a point where reverting to authoritarianism is highly unlikely without some massive external shock. The civil liberties and multi-party competition are baked into the culture.
Right. The roots go deep.
Exactly. Without that consolidation, a country is really vulnerable to democratic backsliding, where the rules of the road are slowly rewritten to indefinitely benefit the people currently in power.
Okay, so if executives naturally seek to consolidate power, if the drivers want to own the road, we should probably look closely at how different countries actually choose those drivers.
We definitely should.
The sources break executive power down into three main systems. You've got presidential, parliamentary, and semi-presidential.
And to understand these systems, you first have to separate two roles. There's the head of state, which is often a ceremonial or representational figure symbolizing the people.
Right.
And then you have the head of government, who is the one actually running the state and enforcing the laws on a daily basis.
Okay, let's start with the presidential system, like we see in Mexico and Nigeria. Here, power is separated from the legislature, and the president is both the head of state and the head of government.
Exactly. It's a combined role.
But looking at Nigeria, it's really interesting. Their current president, Bola Tinubu, didn't just win by getting the most votes overall. Nigeria has this specific electoral rule.
Right, the 25% rule.
Yeah. To win the presidency, a candidate needs a majority of the overall popular vote. Plus, they have to win at least 25% of the vote in two-thirds of Nigeria's states.
And we really have to look at why that mechanical rule exists. Nigeria is a federal republic with deep political and social cleavages.
Cleavages being divisions, right?
Yes. You have major ethnic divisions, groups like the Hausa Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo, coupled with a stark religious divide between the predominantly Muslim North and the Christian South.
Wait, so by requiring 25% across two-thirds of the states, they are mechanically forcing a candidate to campaign outside their own ethnic or religious stronghold.
That's exactly it.
You literally can't win by just pandering to your base in one highly populated region.
Precisely. If a candidate could win solely through massive turnout in their home region, the rest of the diverse country would feel entirely alienated, and that leads to severe instability. So that 25% rule forces the building of a broad national coalition.
That is a fascinating structural fix for a demographic challenge. Now, contrast that with the parliamentary system in the United Kingdom.
Right, a totally different setup.
Here, the executive and legislative branches are fused. The monarch, so King Charles III, is the ceremonial head of state, while the prime minister, like Keir Starmer, is the head of government. But the citizens don't directly vote for the prime minister, do they?
No, they don't. British citizens vote for their local members of parliament. Whichever party secures a majority of seats in the House of Commons basically gets to have their party leader become the prime minister.
What really stands out in the AP materials are the mechanisms built into this parliamentary system, specifically the vote of no confidence in snap elections.
Oh, those are massive.
Yeah, because in a presidential system like the U.S., removing an executive is a huge multi-year constitutional crisis involving impeachment. But in the UK, the parliament can just call a vote of no confidence.
Right.
The prime minister is standing right there at the dispatch box, and if they lose that vote, their government collapses instantly.
It creates a completely different power dynamic. I mean, a parliamentary system is generally highly efficient at passing legislation because the executive, by definition, already controls the legislative majority.
Sure, they have the votes baked in.
Exactly. But the trade-off is extreme vulnerability. The leader can be ousted overnight if they lose the support of their own party. And conversely, a prime minister can call a snap election, basically moving the election date up without warning to try and catch the opposition off guard and expand their party's majority. It is a highly tactical system.
And you have the semi-presidential system, like Russia, which blends the two. You have a dual executive, so a directly elected president and a prime minister.
Theoretically, yes.
Theoretically, the work is divided. But the reality is a massive concentration of power in the presidency. The Russian president dictates foreign policy, appoints top ministers, and can even draft bills, which naturally brings up the debate over executive term limits.
Term limits are a critical metric in comparative government, and the frameworks outline very clear trade-offs here. On one hand, term limits are a vital structural check.
They keep things moving.
Right. They prevent dictatorships, discourage personality-driven rule, and force a healthy rotation of new ideas into the executive branch.
But on the other hand, look at Mexico. They restrict their president to a single 6-year term, which is called a sexennial.
Right, just one term.
If you only get one term, you spend the first 2 years learning how to govern, the middle two actually doing it, and the last two as a lame duck because everyone knows you're about to leave power. It can severely impede long-term policy continuity, right?
Right.
Or force good leaders out.
That is the tension. In Mexico, that single-term limit is a historical overcorrection to prevent the return of single-party dominance, which they experienced for decades under the PRI.
Right. They were burned before.
Exactly. Meanwhile, in Russia, we've seen constitutional rules repeatedly altered or maneuvered around to allow the executive to remain in power, effectively neutralizing the limit entirely.
Well, if an executive has no limits and no map, the car becomes incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
So we had to look at the brakes, which are the legislatures. We typically see two structures in these countries, unicameral, meaning one lawmaking chamber, and bicameral, meaning two.
And how a country actually uses those chambers tells you everything about where the real power lies.
Let's look at the UK's bicameral system. You have the elected House of Commons and the unelected House of Lords. But historically, the House of Lords has been stripped of almost all its teeth.
Very true.
Today, they can't actually veto legislation. They can really only delay it for about a year. So in practice, the UK functions almost like a unicameral system.
Right. And if the UK's House of Lords shows how an institution can be historically stripped of its power, China's National People's Congress shows how an institution can be built from scratch to look powerful while actually doing nothing.
Right, because on paper, the Chinese Constitution says the National People's Congress is the most powerful institution in the government, and it has nearly 3,000 members.
Which is staggering.
But mathematically, having 3,000 people debate a law makes it nearly impossible to actually govern.
Which is entirely the point. In an authoritarian regime, the massive legislature isn't meant to debate or create policy. The actual center of power is the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo Standing Committee, which operates completely behind closed doors.
Oh, I see.
The National People's Congress meets briefly just to rubber stamp and legitimize the policies that were already decided by the executive elite.
So the NPC is basically just a rubber stamp. Now, let's look at Iran, which technically has a unicameral legislature and elected parliament called the Majlis. But they have this secondary body called the Guardian Council. And that consists of 12 unelected members, 6 clerics appointed by the supreme leader, and 6 lawyers nominated by the judiciary.
And what role does that council play in the legislative process?
Well, they act like a toll booth sitting right in front of the parliament. You can't even get your name on the ballot to run for the Majlis unless the Guardian Council lifts the gate.
Exactly.
And even if the Majlis passes a law, the Guardian Council reviews it to ensure it complies with Islamic Sharia law. They can veto anything. So while Iran calls itself unicameral, that toll booth acts very much like an incredibly powerful, unelected upper house.
It is all about identifying the veto points. And the ultimate veto point in any government should be the judiciary. A strong, independent judiciary is the primary defense against that democratic backsliding we discussed earlier.
The sources draw a pretty sharp distinction in the types of legal systems these countries use. So the UK operates on common law, while countries like Russia and Mexico use civil law. What is the practical difference for a citizen relying on those courts?
In a common law system, like the UK, the law is built on precedent. The decisions that judges make in individual cases actually shape and form the law over centuries. Judges have a lot of interpretive power there.
Right, they set the standard.
Yeah, exactly. But in a civil law system, the law is based on a strict, comprehensive set of written codes. Judges in civil law systems don't really create precedent. Their job is simply to apply the specific rule written in the codebook to the case at hand.
But regardless of whether it's common or civil law, the real issue is judicial independence. And the UK system is so interesting here. They have this rich, centuries-old legal history, but like I said at the start, they didn't establish a distinct Supreme Court until 2009.
It's surprisingly recent, yeah.
Before that, the highest court of appeals was actually a subset of the legislature, the House of Lords. They pulled it out and created the Supreme Court to ensure a much clearer separation of powers, which reinforces the rule of law.
And rule of law is a critical concept. It means the law applies equally to everyone, including the state itself. The government can be taken to court by a citizen, and the government can actually lose.
Right.
We have to contrast that with rule by law, which is what we see in China.
The rule by law, so the law isn't an independent standard, it's a weapon wielded by the state.
Exactly. In a rule by law system, The courts are subservient to the ruling party. They are administrative instruments used to enforce the state's will on the populace.
Which perfectly explains the statistic in the AP materials that China has a 99.3% conviction rate in its courts.
It's wild.
That's not because the police are somehow flawlessly accurate. It's because the judiciary is not an independent arbiter. The courts are just the administrative arm of the prosecutor tasked with delivering the government's desired outcome.
And when the judiciary is captured like that, the institutional brakes are entirely removed. The government can basically drive wherever it wants.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. We've looked at the regime rules, the executive drivers, the legislative brakes, and the judicial navigators. But a car doesn't move without fuel, and in comparative politics, the ultimate fuel for any state is legitimacy.
Legitimacy is the foundational concept of a state's survival. It is the citizens' inherent belief that the government actually has the right to rule and exercise power over them.
Without that belief, things fall apart.
Completely. If a state loses legitimacy, it relies solely on coercion and force, which is incredibly expensive and ultimately unsustainable.
So where does that belief come from? Because we've already established that in a hybrid regime, it's not always coming from free and fair elections.
Legitimacy has multiple sources. It can be sustained by tradition and historical continuity. Think of the British monarchy's enduring role. It can be derived from religious heritage, which underpins Iran's theocratic institutions.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or, very commonly, it comes from sheer government effectiveness and economic growth. If an authoritarian government consistently provides physical security, national stability, and rapidly rising living standards, citizens are often willing to accept its right to rule. That grants it performance-based legitimacy.
But what happens when the fuel tank hits empty? Like, if an economic crisis hits or the state fails to provide security and citizens lose that belief, how do they respond?
It depends entirely on the regime. In a consolidated democracy, a loss of legitimacy usually means the ruling party is simply voted out of office at the next election. The citizens use the institutional channels provided.
They just pull the lever for someone else.
Right. But in hybrid or authoritarian regimes, where those institutional channels are blocked or rigged, a lack of legitimacy leads directly to instability. Citizens are basically forced to find other avenues to express their discontent.
This brings us to civil society, how citizens organize themselves outside of the government. The frameworks outline two main models here: pluralist systems and corporatist systems.
Yeah, so in a pluralist system, like the UK, civil society is autonomous. Citizens can freely form interest groups, labor unions, or environmental organizations to lobby the government and influence policy.
So the state stays out of it.
Mostly, yes.
Yeah.
The state doesn't control these groups. They compete openly in the marketplace of ideas.
But in a corporatist system, the government essentially plays bouncer at the club. They heavily regulate civil society, deciding exactly which unions, businesses, or advocacy groups are formally recognized and allowed to sit at the negotiating table with the state.
Right. They structure and control the interaction entirely.
And when a state completely restricts civil society, when the bouncer won't let anyone into the club to voice their grievances, you see social movements rise up. These movements act as external forces, challenging the internal power structures.
We see this constantly in the real world. In Iran, the Green Movement poured into the streets to protest election corruption, and more recently, we saw widespread, sustained protests demanding women's rights and bodily autonomy.
Yeah, those were huge.
And in Nigeria, the NSARS movement saw youth organizing nationwide to protest police brutality and demand basic government accountability. In Mexico, citizens have mobilized in massive numbers over environmental degradation and gender-based violence.
Right, because when the internal avenues for change are blocked, the citizens literally step into the streets to demand the government act.
Which highlights a state's most difficult task, which is managing cleavages. We touched on this with Nigeria's ethnic and religious divisions.
Right, the 25% rule.
Exactly. Cleavages are deep social divisions based on class, ethnicity, religion, or geography, and every country has them. The UK has regional cleavages, most notably with the push for Scottish independence.
So how does the state prevent those cleavages from tearing the country apart?
By accommodating them through institutional design. This might mean using a proportional representation voting system, where the number of seats a minority party gets in the legislature directly matches the percentage of the public vote they won, ensuring their voice is heard.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or it means utilizing gender quotas to mandate female representation in the legislature, which Mexico has actually done with significant success. If a government cannot manage its cleavages fairly, If it continually marginalizes a specific group, democratic consolidation stalls.
And then the legitimacy tanks.
Exactly. The alienated group withdraws its legitimacy, unrest grows, and the state often resorts to authoritarian backsliding, basically using force to maintain control.
Wow. When we look at all these systems together, from the overarching rules of regimes to the driving executives, the legislative brakes, the judicial navigators, and the vital fuel of public legitimacy, it becomes incredibly clear that democracy and dictatorship aren't just theoretical labels on a map.
They aren't. The mechanics of these institutions dictate real life. They determine how easily a law is passed that alters your community. They dictate whether the courts will protect your civil rights or just rubber stamp your conviction.
Yeah.
They're the literal difference between a government that has to bend to a social movement and a government that can just rewrite the Constitution to make that movement illegal.
So we'll leave you with the final thought to mull over. We've discussed how any government's long-term survival relies on the legitimacy granted by its people. But we are living in an era of unprecedented globalization.
We really are.
What happens when global forces, the internet, international markets, global social media, constantly expose citizens to alternative systems of governance? If you live under a strict authoritarian regime, but you can pull out a smartphone and see exactly how citizens in a pluralist democracy advocate for their rights, well, how long can the state control that narrative?
It's a huge question.
Can any authoritarian car keep driving indefinitely if the passengers in the back seat suddenly realize there is a completely different, freer way to travel? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep looking under the hood, and we'll catch you next time.